So let's talk quickly about relative value. What do I mean by relative value? Well, simply put, relative value is when you use some kind of multiple. So let's say price earnings, for instance, or price book, or price sales. What you do here is you make an assumption that the market is pricing more or less correctly, and then you're using some kind of accounting value to scale. Now you can use other things to scale as well, but you are comparing the firms on the basis that what you're scaling at is comparable and that the prices are correct. So multiple valuations is useful, and I'll try to explain how these are linked to fundamental value. So if we start out with value being equal to the free cash flow divided by cost of capital minus growth. This is our sort of basic idea, right? Now, what was free cash flow? Well, essentially we had earnings minus net investment, which is essentially the book value times the return minus the book value times growth. So basically how much you grow the book value and the return you get on the current book value. This can of course be simplified down to being the book value and the return minus growth. Alternative B here is that we take earnings out, say that we have earnings, which then of course makes this term 1, and then we say that we have the book value times growth and divide by the book value times return. Now we have two expressions here for free cash flow, and for those of you who take a quick look at this, you probably understand now that we have earnings 1 minus G over R divided by K minus G being one expression, and then we have the book value R minus G divided by K minus G as our second expression. And this of course turns out to be handy because now we can say that the price earnings is equal to 1 minus G over R divided by K minus G. Now, what does this imply? Well, this guy here is basically the payout ratio. Guy here, of course, gives us that price book is equal to the return minus the growth over the cost of capital minus the growth, which essentially tells us something about value creation. Or NPV if you like. Now, important to understand here is of course that we're comparing payout ratios and we're comparing the value creation. The price book and the price earnings may or may not be exactly so that they make sense in themselves. Book values aren't necessarily market values of the assets, and as such, we don't get a result where we can sort of compare and say something about them in absolute terms, but we can compare companies that have similar type assets and they're priced similarly. In addition to that, of course, we see that if we take return and multiply it by the price earnings ratio, we get return times 1 G over R divided by K minus G, which gives us R minus G over K minus G. Hence, we get that return times price earnings is equal to price book. which is handy in terms of converting these two. So the difference between them is essentially that. So what do we have now? We have price earnings being equal to the payout ratio. So basically how much we earn minus what we reinvest. We have price book being equal to the return minus the growth over the cost of capital minus the growth. But then you say we have this last guy, price sales. What happened to him? Well, let's start out with price earnings. And then we say, well, we need to sort of get rid of earnings. So we multiply by earnings and then we divide by sales. And suddenly you can see now what we have here is essentially the price earnings multiplied by the profit margin. And why is this useful to see? Well, when you're comparing price sales, if you have widely different profit margins or widely different price earnings, you don't really know what you're comparing. But if you have reasonably equal price earnings, then you're basically comparing profit margins. Let's quickly get back to price earnings. Now, what would be sort of normal price earnings here? Well, let's say that we have a case here where we have a return that is equal to the cost of capital. So essentially we're just value conserving. Well, if we insert that, we will basically get that price earnings is just equal to the cost of capital. So far so good, right? Value conserving just means that you get your fair return, nothing more. Also, something that we can take away from this is that this would also be the same as growth being 0, right? So if we insert a 0 here and a 0 there, this becomes 1 over k. So these are basically our two cases. And of course, from a theoretical standpoint, you don't want to necessarily grow something that's value conserving. However, it is giving you your fair return. It's a zero NPV project.